Welcome to Therapist Confidential, a psychotherapy.net podcast. And now, here's your host, Travis Heath.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Therapist Confidential podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. David Elliott, and we'll explore what I think is one of maybe psychotherapy's biggest questions. At least that's what I gauge from talking to other therapists and students and the like, which is, how the heck do people become more securely attached? So we'll dive into attachment styles. Perhaps we'll discuss what creates lasting change, maybe the intersection of attachment and trauma, the role of the therapeutic relationship, this ideal parent figure method, which I find interesting, and just really what an integrative approach to attachment can teach therapists, perhaps of any and every orientation. So, Dr. David Elliott, welcome.
Thank you, Travis. Really glad to be here with you.
Now, for folks that maybe aren't yet familiar with your work and would you mind introducing yourself in whatever way feels comfortable to our listeners?
Okay, sure. So I was born and raised in the Northeast of the U.S. in Connecticut, and did all my college and graduate work in the Northeast as well. Brandeis University and then Harvard University for master's and doctorate degrees. And from a very early age, actually, from around age 11, I knew I wanted to become a clinical psychologist. And people are often surprised by that, but in my experience, it made a lot of sense. I was a pretty anxious kid and pretty insecure, and struggled a fair amount with my own self-experience. And then through various media, particularly television, the Bob Newhart show, where Bob Newhart played a psychologist and it looked like he had a pretty good life and was talking to people who I could sometimes identify with and seemingly helping them. I thought, oh, maybe I could be a psychologist, be a way to help people like me and maybe to help me as well. So I wrote to my grandparents when I was 11 saying, I'm going to be a clinical psychologist. And here I am.
What's interesting about that story is I think, obviously, young children who then become adolescents often have ideas of what they want to do when they quote unquote grow up, and that's awesome. Whether it actually happens or not, it seems like just an important part of that process, imagining, who they might become later on. But rarely does someone at 11 years of age choose something and that actually comes to fruition. So I'm interested in that piece from 11 to actually becoming a clinical psychologist. What was it about that you think made that profession have such staying power for you?
What comes to me as you ask that, just right now, is something about the sensitivity that I developed. And again, some of that sensitivity was problematic because I was anxious and insecure. But also from a very early age, I felt I was able to connect with feelings and with things that were beyond words. I was always very appreciative of nature and animals. From a very, very early age, I got very engaged with blues music, both listening and playing it. And something about the expression of both challenge in life, but like is often the theme in many blues songs. There's challenge, but there's also the possibility of redemption. There's the possibility of, the sun's going to shine on my back door someday. So I felt this, again, this deep sensitivity where I felt like I could relate to suffering, but also to beauty and to love and to hopefulness. And I was able to stay pretty connected to that all through my subsequent schooling and training. Not always, because, various academic settings can be pretty dry and pretty rigid and just focused on the mind and the intellect and less about the heart and the soul. But it's interesting because after I completed my doctorate at Harvard, um, I actually trained for several years in the model called psychosynthesis, which was developed by an Italian psychiatrist, Roberto Assagioli, who was a student and colleague of Jung's and Freud's for some years. But he developed a metapsychology that, similar to Jung, aimed to incorporate not just the lower unconscious, but also what he called the higher unconscious, and to think about human potentials that could also be repressed, just like human anxieties and problematic states that Freud really focused on. So I felt like that was a way, it was almost a coming home to me from the foundation of all I had learned, through some excellent training in the traditional institutes and universities, but also to bring in this other dimension, which was quite relevant in my connecting with Daniel Brown, who is the senior author of the book on the 3 pillars of attachment repair that we published in 2016. And he was a brilliant psychologist and also a deeply wise and well practiced person in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So he also aimed to somehow integrate Western ideas of mind development and well being promotion with the more Eastern, particularly Buddhist approaches and orientations toward that. So those have been interests of mine all along. And I feel like in this work, the integrative attachment therapy, I and the others who developed it have been able to honor these various dimensions. And that's one of the reasons we call it integrative.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by your language of the heart and the soul, which is something that it seems to me, anecdotally, isn't discussed all that often in psychotherapy and in psychology and psychiatry. And I'll go a step further and say that sometimes it's even frowned upon to use such language, which is disappointing to me because elements of what we might call the heart and the soul often seem integral to the work. So I'm very intrigued by that language. Now, okay, I want to get into your expertise a little bit. So this idea of attachment, let's start very generally because I want to understand attachment as you've come to understand it. I mean, I think most anyone who goes into this field, and most of our listeners, I assume, are therapists or therapists in training of some sort, right? There might be other folks who aren't that listen, but I think a lot of them are therapists. And even in like an introductory psychology course, they'll see the sort of famous Ainsworth videos, and about attachment. And so I think most people have some idea of attachment and attachment styles. But if we could start just by defining terms, I want to come to understand attachment through your eyes and how you understand it.
Okay, terrific. So I'll start with sort of a larger context about human beingness and human well-being. And there's a particular um, researcher and psychologist author, Sidney Blatt, who's no longer living, but was very prolific and productive in his work. He's based at Yale University during most of his career. And he presented a pretty basic model for development and well-being, where he said that we all have 2 primary drives: the drive toward relatedness and the drive toward self-definition. And ideally, both of those are in balance. Relatedness is the drive to be in close connection with other people and to have rewarding interactions and connections with others. And self-definition is individuation, essentially, the capacity to be a unique and distinct self. And he suggested, again, very simply, it's an elegant, simple model with lots of implications and complexity that could be added around it. But he said that well-being is the balance for each individual person, whatever that may be. There's no rigid structure about what balance means, but a reasonable balance between those 2 drives. Right? Now, this is connected to and similar and it probably emerged partly from Blatt's understanding of John Bowlby, considered the father of attachment field. And, Bowlby highlighted that he didn't highlight the individuation aspect so much, but he highlighted the drive to be in close connection with others, which he called the attachment behavioral system. And though he and others following him have suggested there are 6 to 10 or so different behavioral systems, depending on how you think about them, within us, but the core one relating to attachment is the attachment behavioral system, which developed through evolution to help us stay close to caregivers, which would maximize our survival and maximize our potential toward reproduction. Again, this is just in an evolutionary set of terms, but if you think of the herd animals, like a group of deer, the young deer who have the instinct and follow that instinct to stay close to the adults when there are predators all around are more likely to survive. Okay? And of course, the adults who keep track of the young ones and kind of nudge them toward the adults if they get a little too far afield, they're going to support the survival of the young as well. So it's different with humans. We're not herd animals. Bowlby highlighted the evolutionary aspect of this and how it's fundamental. It's fundamental. Bowlby pointed out, and lots of research subsequent to that, it's not only fundamental for survival and survival to reproductive capacity and potential, but it's fundamental to healthy development of a variety of developmental lines as well. So we find that the research has found that in young children with secure attachment, various developmental lines show earlier milestone attainment. Right? The brain develops structurally faster and fuller when there's secure attachment. When there's insecure attachment, what does that, well, let's say, what does that mean? Okay, what is insecure attachment? Actually, let's start with what secure attachment means. Right? Basically, Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, the mother of attachment, the attachment field, highlighted various terminologies, but essentially highlighted that secure attachment is the basic sense of confidence that when a threat or a danger or a need arises within us, there will be some possibility for those needs being met and those dangers and threats being mitigated. Okay? In humans, it's primarily relational early on because the infant is fully dependent for quite a bit of time on the availability and the suitability and the capacities of the caregivers to provide. Okay, so Erik Erikson, in his developmental model with his stages of lifespan development, what's the fundamental, the first one? It's basic trust or basic mistrust. And that's essentially an attachment challenge. It's the establishment of basic trust, which is, hey, if I'm being threatened, I'm not alone. I can rely on somebody or something to help. A basic mistrust is something difficult happens or something's threatening. Hey, I'm on my own. I got to figure out how to do it myself. I've got to try to marshal the resources to get to me to make sure I'm going to be okay. Okay? So when there's a need to do it all oneself, or there's more of a sense of I've got to take care of myself. I can't count on others to be there for me sufficiently and safely. That takes resources that might otherwise go toward developmental processes and developmental dynamics. So that's one way to understand, this linkage between security and promotion of developmental lines and insecurity and relative inhibition of those.
One thing I've noticed about attachment theory ideas, I hesitate to say research, and I wonder if you've noticed this too, and this happens with things, I think it always has, but especially these days with TikTok and social media and all the things. I mean, on one hand, attachment theory seems to be everywhere, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I do worry that, and attachment theory is not alone in this, the way that sometimes it becomes oversimplified, where, you're securely or insecurely attached and it automatically means X, Y, or Z. And it starts to feel like some of the nuance is sort of wringed out of it, some of the complication. And those things, of course, are important, I think, to the human experience. So I appreciate the in-depth response. And on what I was just saying, I'm wondering your experience of Because, and maybe this is just me, right? But I see attachment theory everywhere these days in sort of pop culture. And again, I don't think that's necessarily good nor bad. I think it's complicated, but I'm wondering what you make of the sometimes oversimplification of attachment theory in pop culture.
A great question. Yeah, I recognize too what you're describing. There's several ways I think about that. One is that, it refers to what I was speaking to earlier, that attachment dynamics are pretty fundamental. And security promotes psychological, emotional, and relational well being. And insecurity interferes with psychological and emotional and relational well being. And estimates of the prevalence of attachment security and insecurity are really striking. So, in a Western culture, society like ours, it's estimated that between 40 and 50 or even more percent of people have attachment insecurity in some measurable or identifiable way. So that means, you know, 50 to 60% are secure or have secure attachment dynamics. So if you think about what that means in terms of numbers and population percentages, that means there's a huge number of people who experience the phenomena associated with insecurity. And these estimates are just based on measurable patterns. If we think about how everybody has an attachment pattern or style, I like to use the word style for an attachment pattern that's not in the insecure range, but mirrors one of the insecure patterns or dynamics, because we all tend to, you know, operate primarily from one of the most usually identified attachment subtypes: secure, insecure, uh, anxious, preoccupied; insecure, dismissing or avoidant; and insecure, fearful or disorganized. Okay, so even if we're not in an insecure range of those latter three patterns, they still, the forms of them can influence our behavior when we're under some sort of stress or relational stress. Now, because of the prevalence of insecurity and the fact that the patterns themselves tend to be passed on down through the generations, what I mean by that is that if my parents are secure, I'm more likely to be secure. If my parents have a form of insecurity, I'm more likely to have usually their form of insecurity or forms of insecurity also. So, because of the high prevalence and the relative ways that aspects of our culture actually can interfere with the development of security, it's a big issue. And so the attention to it in our culture is right. I think there's value in people having some understanding about that, because it can lead people to find ways to hopefully remedy some of the problematic aspects of whatever patterns they have. Now, a downside, which is common to our culture and in many different topics, is that people like simple or simplistic
Right.
depictions or understandings of things. And people will say, "Oh, I'm an anxious preoccupied," or "I'm an avoidant," kind of almost reifying these patterns, which I don't think is. I mean, there's some value in it if it orients somebody toward a particular way of looking or thinking about themselves and their relationships. But we're much more than just a pattern. We have a pattern, and we're more than our patterns. I would really like an attachment spectrum model that was developed by Sue Marriott and Ann Kelly, who really highlight that though we have a center. So if we take a spectrum where anxious preoccupied is on one side of the spectrum, where we tend to have like a hyperactivation of the attachment system, like when we're in close connection, we get really frightened or nervous that our partner's going to leave us or going to be get interested in somebody else, and that we have to constantly be paying attention to the other to try to keep their interest. That's the anxious preoccupied pattern. On the other end of the spectrum would be the dismissing or avoidant, which is when I start to feel close with somebody, I get scared because in my history, closeness meant the experience of rejection or hurt in some way. So I've learned to be more self reliant and self sufficient And so I'm going to that's why it's called avoiding relationship or dismissing, like pushing away the other in order to establish some sort of optimal distance. Now, if you think of that as a spectrum with the middle being more secure, the middle is that, okay, there's maybe some tendency toward one or the other, but overall there's relative balance. We don't occupy a fixed position along that spectrum. There's a center of gravity, like there's a point around which I'll tend to move to the right or to the left along that spectrum. But it's not a fixed place. Like someday on a good day, I might be, right solid and smack in the middle of the secure range. But, something's happening. My relationship partner is, kind of distracted, and it's like, uh-oh, and I'm going to move a little more toward the anxious preoccupied. There's like a migration along that spectrum. So I think the recognition that we can move depending on conditions and how we experience them is a little, it's an added complexity, but it's a relatively understandable complexity that will limit the problems of just thinking, like, okay, I'm this or I'm that, and only looking at it one way.
Yeah, I appreciate the flexibility you're referencing. And that's where I see sometimes people getting themselves into trouble where, you said, this was eloquent, we are more than our patterns. And I'd love to hear more about that. I'll also say that sometimes with attachment styles or patterns, they can start to feel, or I don't know if feel's the right word, it can start to feel like those are fixed, right? And people hear the story that these are fixed in some way. And then if it goes a step further, it can feel entrenched in one's identity, right? So all of a sudden, it's not like I'm in this pattern or I have a tendency to be in this pattern. It's I'm this way, right? And that step seems like, again, that isn't necessarily a problem of attachment theory in particular, but it's like a manifestation of what can happen when a pattern is taken on as part of one's identity, if that makes sense.
Makes so much sense. Yeah. Yeah. And you're pointing out, Travis, one of the difficulties or problematic aspects of identifying with something. We do tend to identify. That's also, I think, built into us as part of the development of a sense of self over time. But if we identify with something, particularly with something that's problematic, then that becomes part of our identity. And there's going to be difficulty relinquishing it because even if, oh, I'm an anxious person, I have anxious preoccupied attachment. And, that's who I am. That's how I understand my history and my relationships and what shows up in my life. So then, say I go to therapy because of what shows up in my life being problematic, and the therapist makes a, valiant effort to try to help me develop earned security from my insecure state. There's likely to be some resistance, at least unconsciously, to letting go of having the anxious preoccupied pattern, because that means I would have to let go of that aspect of my identity. And identity loss is noxious. Identity loss we experience as problematic. And so we can tend to grab onto and grasp aspects of whatever we identify with, sometimes for better and often for worse as well.
Mm.
And you mentioned the phrasing of we're more than our patterns.
Yes.
This is a notion that has been called disidentification. And this was a term coined by Assagioli from the psychosynthesis context that he developed. And it's essentially the notion that we have various characteristics and we are more than any of those characteristics or even the combination of them. And it turns out from psychological research that the capacity to disidentify is a component of well-being, component of satisfaction in life with self. And the opposite is to rigidly identify, say, oh, I am my patterns. So if we're able to disidentify, then we can say, I'm depressed, I have depression, and there's something more to me than depression. And it puts a foot in the door, so to speak, to operate in a way that includes aspects of our experience, components of ourselves, but gives us space around that and within that to operate from more than what any of those individually or even collectively might limit us to.
And what you're talking about now seems like maybe an entry point into therapy, because often, I won't say always, but often, I think when, especially in this day and age, it's interesting because I'm also a licensed psychologist. And so, 20 plus years ago when I started this work, it was much more rare that someone would come in with a diagnosis already in hand, like, oh, I'm this, this sort of identification with something, or I'm this or that, like even teaching students the term narcissism 20 years ago. I mean, I would have to sort of talk about this, what this meant. Now, if I bring up narcissism, every student has an opinion on it. And, it's sometimes now I have to define it just because a lot of those opinions maybe don't actually match the reality of what we're talking about. So it's just different. And I think people come in often having already diagnosed themselves or having a loved one or someone else in their life having diagnosed them.
Right.
So because of that, attachment as well, people will often come in, I've noticed, already talking about what their attachment style is. Now, to me, it doesn't, it's not so important right off the bat whether that's right or wrong or whatever. It's just more of an observation that they're coming in with these stories to begin
Yeah.
with.
Yes.
It doesn't happen all the time, but I just notice it happening more and more. And what I'd like to get into then is, so somebody comes into therapy to see you, and I imagine you're often operating from the lens of attachment.
Sure.
How do you start out the process? And then, if you could start to give us an example of maybe if someone is more often than not falling into a pattern of, let's say, anxious, preoccupied.
Yeah.
Right. So let's say, it starts to become more clear that that's a pattern that's common in that person's life. Maybe they come in and they're telling you that's the pattern, or maybe together through conversation, you're noticing it. Presumably, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, presumably the idea is to help someone become aware of that pattern and then hopefully find ways to feel more secure and less anxious and preoccupied. So I'm wondering if you could take us through the process of noticing that and then what you might actually do with someone to help address that.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So let's take the first scenario that you laid out, which is somebody coming in
Yep.
saying, okay, I am anxious, preoccupied. So that's a general statement. It's an identification of sorts with whatever is understood about what that means by that person.
Yeah.
My first approach would be to try to get to know the individual who's saying that he or she or they are anxious, preoccupied. So I might say, okay, so you're telling me you have some sense that you're anxious, preoccupied. What does that mean for you? What is it that's happening in your life and in your relationships that leads you to resonate with that term and how you've come to understand it? So I really want to, as quickly as possible, just get to the person's actual experience, letting fall aside focus on the terms or the constructs and the self-limitations that can come from that. So as the person describes the patterns or the experiences that the person's linking to the terms, of course, I'll have my attachment lens operative there. I do my best to be able to switch lenses at various times because we're going to see whatever is etched on our lenses, whether or not it's there. So it's important to keep that awareness in mind. But if there's certain things, certain patterns that stand out that are consistent with what the patient or client is presenting as a term, or even if there's no term, but if there's patterns that are becoming prominent, I'll say something, what I'm hearing from you is a description of a certain kind of experience that I have some familiarity with from my work with people. And let me tell you a little bit about what's resonating in terms of what you're telling me with this idea. And then I'll give a basic psychoeducation about attachment dynamics, saying that based on our early experiences with primary caregivers, we develop expectations about what later relational experience will be like. So if we had really close and loving and comfortable, security-enhancing experience with our caregivers, we're going to expect that in our primary relationships later on. But if we had problematic, if we had some hurt or a lot of fear that was unresolved or some sort of abuse in relation to our caregivers or lack of protection from abuse, we're going to expect that closeness is going to lead to similar type problems. And we find ways to adapt, we find ways to cope. That attachment dynamics are essentially coping strategies that we come up with automatically in the context of close interpersonal relationship because we expect that our current relationship experience will be similar to what our early relationship experience was. So, we'll explain that. I'll normalize what the person is presenting. I'll present a bigger context for it so person doesn't have to feel crazy or being alone with it. But as you said, these days it's hard to feel like, one's attachment dynamics are unique because it's presented so widely across various media and cultural forms.
And so you go through this part, and then I could imagine someone saying like, "Okay, got it. Okay, doc, how do you help me become securely attached? Like, what do we have to do here?"
This is where I'll speak a little bit about the integrative attachment therapy model and set of methods. And one of the reasons we call it integrative is that it directly includes and interrelates a number of different dimensions that are all problematic when attachment security has not formed. So the same developmental conditions that promote the insecure internal working models or insecure expectations of what later relationship will be like, they also interfere with, no surprise, the capacity to be relational, right? The capacity to be what we call collaborative. And so collaborative capacity in relationship is the ability to work together toward a commonly defined goal in which each person, the self and the others, have something valuable and possibly different to contribute. So the other's contributions are valued and the self's contributions are valued as well. Okay, so collaborative dynamics are problematic when there's insecurity, and the particular dynamics differ depending on what form of insecurity there is. We call this the first pillar of the three pillars model of integrative attachment therapy. It's the first pillar because it's foundational. It's foundational for relationships and particularly for psychotherapy process. Okay? Giovanni Liotti, a researcher in the field who's unfortunately died some years ago, highlighted that all good therapy is collaborative. Okay? Many times the therapist is seen as an expert, just expected to do something to fix the person coming for help. But the therapist may be an expert on therapy, hopefully has some expertise on therapy process, but is not an expert on the client. Okay? The client or the patient has to bring unique characteristics and understandings of the self and willingness to get to know oneself and to pay attention so that there can be a collaborative dynamic process between the therapist and the patient or client. So I'll explain some of that to the person, say that therapy is collaborative. We've come up with goals together. You do your part, I'll do my part. We can challenge each other if it seems like either of us are not doing our part. So that's fundamental. It's like a fundamental relational core of the work. And it's also particularly significant, we think, because all the psychotherapy research on outcomes, looking at what are the factors that determine the effectiveness of psychotherapy, they all point to what? The therapy relationship. Yeah. So the quality of the relationship, the experience of the relationship is really key. Now, John Bowlby, in his early recommendations about therapy for attachment and security, highlighted that the relational dynamic is really fundamental. And that's become a core for, I would say, most approaches to therapy for attachment and security. The quality of the relationship, I like to call it the therapist as good attachment figure model, or TAGAF, therapist as good attachment figure. The idea is to give the client new and different positive relational experience that will get internalized and remedy some of the problematic internalizations that expect problematic experience in relationships. Okay, so that's important. Research shows it. Pillars in the field highlighted this, and it's a core component of most approaches to therapy. Now, let's move to the second pillar. The same conditions that contribute to problematic attachment experience and internal working models also impair what we call metacognitive development, or as Peter Fonagy and John Allen and Alan Bateman call it, the capacity to mentalize the experience of self and others. So metacognition, mentalization, most simple way to describe those is that they're the capacity to take perspective, the capacity to basically disidentify. It's like, oh, I'm having this thought, but it's just a thought. I love the bumper sticker that says, don't believe everything you think. That's a guidance for disidentification. Also, don't believe everything you think about what's happening in the other, right? Because we can project onto others and then react to our projections rather than to the actual person's experience. So there's various ways through the IAT model and through a variety of therapies for attachment and security that help to enhance the capacity to take perspective. I would actually say that I've not been able to identify any method of psychotherapy whose effectiveness is not significantly contributed to by the enhancement of metacognition, the enhancement of mentalization, the enhancement of taking perspective. All therapies help people take broader perspective on their experience. So those are the first two pillars, collaborative enhancement, metacognitive enhancement. Now we get to the third pillar, which is what is particularly unique as a contribution to attachment repair psychotherapy. And essentially what that involves is the client's engagement with embodied relational imagery of the self as a young child in close relationship with imagined ideal caregivers. Okay, so the process involves the therapist and the client together co-creating an experientially imaginative field where the client first comes to feel him or her themselves as a very young child, not just picturing the self as a child, but ideally actually feeling oneself as a young child. And in that context, envisioning and experiencing as though they were growing up in a family different than their family of origin, that they were growing up in a family where all their attachment needs were met in a reasonable way, where the parents were embodying the various characteristics and ways that we understand parents can promote security in their young children. So what this does is it creates a rich inner landscape experience, an experiential field where the client can have direct experiences of security enhancing caregiving. Why is that important? Well, for several reasons. We can value the TAGAF approach, the therapist as good attachment figure approach. There's merit to that. It's good for the therapist to try to be a good attachment figure, honoring Bowlby, honoring so many approaches to psychotherapy for insecurity. But one of the challenges for that that I believe impedes the completeness of the transformation that can happen through that approach alone is that the therapist can be a really good attachment figure, but the therapist is not the child's parent. And the patient or the client can have a really positive experience as adult patient and client with the adult therapist. But in that context, the patient is not a child. So that the patient might internalize this new positive experiential adult to adult therapist to client relationship, but that can maybe just sit alongside the original internal working model of the self as needy, vulnerable young child with actual parents. And so we believe that it's additionally helpful and transformative to, in the context of the therapist as good attachment figure relationship, that the two of them collaboratively create this imagery field where the client actually experiences the self as young child, goes to those early inner experiences that were most operative during the first years of life when attachment was being formed, and to have these new and different experiences with actual imagined parents, not not like new positive versions of their actual parents, but parents as though they could be exactly all the ways that the uh, actual parents may have been good, but also ways that the actual parents may have been not able to promote security. One more thing I'll say about that is that what we're aiming for through the imagery is helping the person engage with this process, not mentally, not through cognitive experience, but through the body, through feelings, through physiological states, through affective states, through the operating system that was prominent and the only operating system during the first 2 years of life. Starting around the third, fourth years of life, we start to develop our cognitive capacities. And by the fourth, fifth year of life, sort of the narrative, linear model of operating system becomes our prominent operating system. And the bodily based, visceral, affective, implicit memory system that was operative during the first 2 years of life is still available, but much less operative. We believe that if we can activate that early system and provide new positive attachment experience in connection to that system, that's what's going to help transform the problematic internal working models to become secure internal working models that help with relational experience.
I'm fascinated by this idea of activating that early system, because I could imagine someone listening to what you were just describing and maybe walking through some imagery, all well intended, but not actually activating what, it just becomes a cognitive exercise, essentially, which is, you've been very clear that's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to get away from that cognitive system. What have you learned about how to actually activate that system?
So, as part of the general structure of the ideal parent figure imagery process, and I'll emphasize general structure because a really important principle with this is that although there are steps to the sequence of the ideal parent figure process, we never try to fit the client to the process. We don't try to fit the client to the method. We always adjust the method to fit the client. Okay. That's a really important consideration here. This is not a manualized approach. There is a structure, but we're always willing to let go and improvise according to the needs that are arising in the moment with that unique individual and the unique dyadic experience and exchange that's happening in the room. But the foundational aspect of doing this method is to bring the client's awareness inward to the body and away from mental activity. So I might say, feel yourself in the chair, just adjust the body as you're sitting there and let the body kind of move and shift and adjust in whatever ways feel like you feel like it's right now. Okay, so bringing attention there. I suggest notice your breathing, the natural inhalation, exhalation of the breath. Feel the sensations, the movements in the body as the breath is occurring in its natural way. I might say, after some focus on the breath, go ahead and look through the body and find where in the body right now is most comfortable. Even if most comfortable is just a little comfortable, but notice where is the most comfortable place right now. I typically don't say most relaxed because sometimes people have trouble identifying relaxation, particularly if they're really stressed or having problematic states. So I'll just say, where's the most comfortable place, even if it's just a little comfortable. So you see, each of these methods, each of these sort of particular framings help bring awareness and attention to the body and bodily experience. And we feel like that's the context for then going into the imagery itself. So once we've established that bodily ground, then I'll suggest, okay, now let yourself imagine in a felt sense way that you're becoming younger and younger and feeling yourself more and more as a very young child in whatever ways that occurs to you now. You might notice your sense of the body getting a little smaller, maybe becoming a little more child size. If you do, just notice that. If you don't, that's fine. But in some way, feel yourself becoming and feeling more and more from the inside like a very young child. So you notice the emphasis on felt sense, on direct experience, not on thinking, not even on picturing, not like visualizing, not see yourself as a child. That's a third person directive, but feel yourself from the inside. That's a first person experiential awareness that we want to promote.
I think, and maybe this is the goal, but I think often people, so you kind of laid out these 3 pillars, right?
Yeah.
And I think what people would likely take from that is, oh, well, if you can execute these together well enough, the person will now sort of migrate into becoming more securely attached. I mean, is that essentially what happens, or do you see the outcome and maybe more aptly said, the process of that happening a little differently?
No, I think you framed it the way it typically happens, that over time, you can't just do 1 or 2 iterations of this. With somebody who has less problematic attachment dynamics, it's a shorter amount of time, just like in any therapy process. If the presenting problems are, relatively mild, it's probably a shorter therapy process. People who come in with complex PTSD and some really problematic personality disorders, it's and disorganized, fearful attachment, which is often associated with both of those conditions. It's gonna be a longer process, but we have found that it's less long, less lengthy dynamic therapy process than without this approach. One of the key effective elements of this, or we believe what's transformative, is that it's the repeated experience of positive internal states associated with attachment experience. So in the imagery, it might take a while for any particular client to come to imagine and really directly experience caregivers who are attachment security promoting. But once they do, they have direct experience with positive internal states connected with attachment relationships. And that's fundamentally what security is. It's having positive states rather than negative states associated with close interpersonal relationship. We first see changes happening in the imagery, that within the imagery, somebody with the avoidant or dismissing pattern initially might say, well, I see there's parents there, but they're kind of on the other side of the room. I don't want them to get any closer. I might say, these parents recognize that you have a need for this amount of distance right now, and they would never think of pressing closer than is comfortable for you at the moment. So just notice that they're here with you, they're respecting your need right now, and feel what it's like that you don't have to worry that they're gonna get closer than feels comfortable at this moment, right? Over time, number of sessions later, that person might say, "Yeah, okay, I see these parents, I feel they're here, and they're just on the other side of the table right now. They're a little bit closer." And that feels okay. It's kinda surprising. Yeah, just feel surprised by that it feels kind of okay. So we mirror and enhance whatever positive experiences they have in the context of the imagery, and, that changes in the imagery, and then we start to see that manifesting in the person's between therapy life as well. And there are ways to try to root that even more fully in the person's, life outside of therapy too.
Yeah, I'm mindful of time here, but I've got a couple more questions I really want to ask you. We're mentioning trauma, and
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you distinguish between attachment and trauma as you're working. I mean, so for example, have you found that if someone has, sort of identifies with certain patterns of anxious attachment, that they're more likely to have trauma? Are there instances where there isn't very much trauma? And how do you work differently depending on the amount of trauma that, and not just the amount, but the intensity of trauma that one may have experienced?
Yeah, this is a really important area. I'm glad you're bringing it up. Trauma is also a domain within our culture now that's seemingly everywhere, right?
Yes.
But
Yeah. Everything is trauma, and I'm not minimizing that or mocking
no,
it. I'm
no.
just saying, like, and maybe that came about for good reason, because at one point in time, maybe folks felt like people weren't listening to their experiences. And so one way to get folks, especially folks like you and I, to really listen is to say, hey, this is trauma, right? And so I think it comes from an understandable place where people just want to be heard and they want their experiences understood. And a byproduct of this is like everything is seemingly trauma.
And then you link attachment trauma, and you're off to the races there. But
Yes.
but it is important. It is important to be aware of. There's a principle from research that's been done looking at attachment formation and trauma during early childhood, and also trauma experience in the context of whatever attachment dynamics were present at the time of later trauma. So, to put it most succinctly, if somebody has insecure attachment dynamics by the age of 2 to 3, they're much more susceptible to having adverse experiences be traumatic and lead to a post-traumatic condition than if somebody was secure and experienced those very same adverse circumstances over the course of development. The presence of attachment insecurity, particularly the disorganized fearful form by age 2, significantly increases the likelihood that the person will develop during adolescence and adulthood a personality disorder, such as borderline personality or narcissistic personality. So security, as I referred to earlier, is a mitigating factor in supporting developmental resilience and developmental strength. Now, in terms of resilience, just looking at adulthood, we find that if an adult has some sort of traumatic experience, then the attachment status, I guess this basically says again what I referred to a moment ago, but I'll say it a little differently. That the attachment status at the time of the trauma determines whether that trauma will actually form into a post-traumatic condition, which would need particularly focused intervention to resolve, or whether the experience that might be traumatic otherwise would just not require as much remedy, not require as much therapeutic process. So if somebody, for example, in the military who's secure and experiences an attack to, say, their division, to some place where they are. So, this is relevant now, unfortunately, in our world, too relevant. But somebody who, say, some bombing happens and there's people killed, something that is likely to be traumatic. Well, if somebody is secure and has that experience, the more traditional methods of exposure-based trauma treatment are more likely to be more effective for that person. But if somebody has an insecure attachment structure internally and experience the same attack, the same bombing, and the same loss of life witnessed, then the exposure-based treatments are not only likely to be not effective, but actually can be more traumatizing, can be more problematic. Okay? So when somebody comes to me and indicates some sort of traumatic history, recent and or past, I first want to assess the attachment status. Because if the person is secure and was secure at the time of the trauma, I know that I can engage with the more traditional exposure-based treatments for short-term traumatic intervention. But if somebody was insecure at the time of coming to me and or insecure at the time of the trauma, I'm going to do attachment-focused work toward earning security prior to any focus on the traumatic experience. Because building attachment security builds internal structure. It builds resilience within the self-structure that becomes really important and foundational for any exposure-based treatment. Right? That structure is necessary for the person to be able to tolerate the exposure, whether it's through typical methods or the EMDR exposure-based approach, all of which are tremendously valuable in some contexts, but also have limitations in other contexts. So the attachment trauma understanding and how they relate to each other and interrelate, I think, is very important for clinicians to have.
Something I'm really appreciating about your approach is it's the way it tends to nuance to the individual person, the kind of non-manualized sort of nature that you're describing. And across however people are working, I've noticed anecdotally correlation between, folks who tend to make an approach that's more made to order for the person in front of them, and then the person in front of them experiencing that as effective rather than, a one size fits all sort of approach. So I'm really appreciating that as I'm listening to your work. Okay, last question I want to ask. A sort of critique, I guess. I don't know if that's quite the right word, but I'll use it. A critique I've heard of attachment work is that it doesn't, like, how does it account for culture, people will say, So across culture, well, attachment may not happen exactly the same way. There could be cultural differences. I'm wondering how you make sense of that idea of culture and attachment.
Yeah, Bowlby and Ainsworth and the early attachment researchers believed that the attachment behavioral system and the ways that it operates are universal. Okay, that they have cross-cultural validity. And Mary Ainsworth did research in Uganda with Ugandan mothers and infants, and was able to point out the similarity to dynamics of mothers and infants in Baltimore, Maryland, in the USA. So there is some evidence that there is cross-cultural validity. But I think it's important to recognize limits in that as well, particularly because sensitivity to cultural issues and dynamics and differences has become much more prominent appropriately in our world these days. The way that we operate with the three pillars model of integrative attachment therapy, I believe accommodates for differences as they may appear in any particular client of any particular cultural origin. And there's a particular way that happens. Our approach includes the research-based understanding and the attachment field understanding of certain factors that have been shown to contribute to the development of attachment security. So we have an approach that we call or an element of this, which is the 5 conditions that promote attachment security. The first is the experience of the caregiver providing safety, or providing protection, so that the child, more often than not, has a sense of safety in relation to the caregivers. Second condition is that the caregivers are attuned to the inner states and the wants and needs of the child to a good enough degree so the child feels seen and recognized and contingently responded to. Third is that the caregivers are soothing and comforting when the child is in distress and upset. So the child is able to internalize the sense that when I'm having some trouble, some distress, soothing comfort is available. The fourth is that the parents take delight in the child. Not 100% of the time, no parents can be delighted in their children all the time. But to a good enough degree, the parents are delighted in the very being of the child, not in what the child does necessarily, not in the production, not in the accomplishments only, but in the very beingness of the child. That tends to promote self-esteem in the child along with the security. And the fifth is the parents support exploration and discovery. They support exploring and discovering and having his or her their unique experience that promotes the development of the self. So in the imagery, we tend to include these elements if they don't spontaneously come in when the client as child is in the imagery. But, and this speaks to the question that you're raising and the issue you're raising, we don't believe that those 5 conditions are necessarily always the right ones that any particular one needs. So usually in this process, before I introduce, if needed, any of the 5 conditions, I'll leave it open. Say something like, and these parents are able to be with you in all the ways that you would most want and need for your sense of well-being as a child, for your sense of being most fully you in the best sense. Framing it that way says that I don't know exactly what that person needs. That person may come from a culture very different and unfamiliar to me. But I'm assuming that because every child has caregivers and probably some caregiver activity is going to be more beneficial than others, and there are going to be differences across cultures. We do see that in the prevalence rates of different forms of patterns of attachment across countries. But if I say, notice these parents are with you, they're with you in the ways that help you feel safe and secure. I don't have to know what those ways are. I trust the wisdom and the core experiences of the client to come up with those experiences in the imagery.
That's a beautiful way to end, trusting the wisdom of the people we're in conversation with.
One more thing I'd just say,
Yeah.
one way we frame all of this in this process is it supports the notion that it's never too late to have a happy childhood.
Yeah, see, I love that because I'll often hear people say things like, we'll just repeat things that we've heard over and over and over again, without thinking about it, just because we've heard it someplace
Yeah.
without really taking the time to, think about what it means. But people will say, well, you can't change the past. And as someone who's really interested in narratives and stories, of course, there's truth to that. Like the events of the past, we literally can't change. But the way we relate to those events, the stories that we tell about those events, that can then change how we feel and make sense of those events. So it's like, yes, we literally cannot change the events that have happened in the past, but boy, there's a lot of room to change our relationship with them.
That's a good point. So true. I agree completely. Yes.
Our hour flew by. Dr. David Elliott, that's, as we were saying before, that's a sign of a good conversation. So I appreciate you taking the time and hope that we can talk again soon.
I would love that. Thanks so much, Travis, for hosting me. Great conversation.